Chapter 1. The night. The stars went out. It started as a handful of bright points, where no bright points should be, moving against the familiar geometry of constellations, as if someone had taken a pen to the oldest map humanity owned and begun to rewrite it in real time. At first, the astronomers did what people always do when the impossible taps on the glass. They tried to make it normal. A satellite launch, a private array, a defense project nobody bothered to announce. In a small observatory outside Santiago, Dr. Eliana Ruiz leaned into a cracked eyepiece and felt her pulse tighten in her throat. The points weren't twinkling. They were marching. Straight lines, equal spacing, a silence so perfect it felt deliberate. Then the points multiplied, spreading across the thermosphere with the calm precision of a knife laid down on a table. Over the next hour, the objects grew larger, and the polite explanations fell apart. Their outlines sharpened into shapes no aerospace engineer on Earth could have drawn. Not because they were bigger, because they were wrong. Wrong in a way the mind pushed against, like trying to hold a thought that refused to be held. The first hulls came into focus, like serrated mountains riding the upper atmosphere. Vast, jagged frames bristling with ribbed structures that looked less built than grown. Then a second wave slid behind them, smooth and gleaming, surfaces shimmering like liquid metal, as if their skins couldn't decide what to be. And then, briefly, there was a third type, a shape that didn't reflect starlight at all. It absorbed it, a moving absence, like someone had carved a ship from shadow and taught it how to glide. Ruiz swallowed hard. 3 designs, 1 conclusion. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a visitor. This was an arrival. Within minutes, every major telescope on the planet pivoted skyward. The chatter hit the amateur forums first, then broke the surface of public life when power grids flickered and thousands of communications satellites went dark. Screens in living rooms, command centers, and subway stations filled with static. Then snapped to a single image, a colossal vessel rotating gently above the curve of the Earth. No nation's insignia, no identifying marks, just an alien silhouette in low orbit, so large it didn't read as a ship at first glance. It read as a second moon that had chosen a side. It drifted, eclipsing whole swaths of continents beneath it, turning cities into dim halos around a shadow no one had a name for. People poured into streets and onto rooftops, phones clenched in trembling hands. In cities, traffic froze as drivers climbed out of their cars and stared up. News anchors abandoned their scripts mid-sentence when their teleprompters died. Priests and imams and rabbis gathered people under open skies and led prayers that came out hushed, as if volume might offend whatever was listening. A child in Rio de Janeiro tugged her mother's sleeve and asked very softly, "Mom, are the stars falling?" Her mother kept staring, mouth parted. Not because she didn't have an answer, because the answer was too big to fit inside words. In Moscow, a pensioner stepped onto his balcony with a cigarette he never lit, then dropped to his knees and wept like he'd been waiting his whole life for the world to end, and was furious it had picked tonight. In a transatlantic cockpit, a pilot flicked his instruments in disbelief as radar turned meaningless. He tried it again, like trying could force reality back into its old rules. Then the broadcast came. It began as a low, unearthly tone, vibrating through every speaker, every radio, every screen. Even ancient transistor radios crackled awake in basements that hadn't heard a signal in decades. The tone didn't blare. It didn't posture. It simply arrived, like winter, in hundreds of languages. Some human, some impossible to categorize. The message poured in, each word clear and cold as a scalpel. The Zalaran Empire had arrived. The voice was neither male nor female, neither synthetic nor organic. It spoke with eerie calm, like a clerk reading policy to someone begging for mercy. Earth had been deemed a critical acquisition zone. Its inhabitants would be offered the mercy of surrender and relocation. Compliance would ensure survival. Resistance would mean extinction. In living rooms and offices, in the echoing halls of parliaments, and the sealed depths of military bunkers, the message repeated in a steady, unhurried cadence, as if the outcome had already been signed. It did not shout. It did not swell with theatrical rage. It simply stated, with the indifference of a force of nature, that the age of human dominion was over. World leaders vanished behind sealed doors, summoning emergency councils, dragging contingency plans off shelves where they'd sat for decades, like superstition. Fighter squadrons launched into the upper atmosphere, first as a show of readiness, then as a reflex of panic when the alien ships began deploying long, filament-like structures into the ionosphere. The air itself started to feel occupied. Somewhere in Washington, a general demanded an immediate strike, but nobody could agree on what to hit. How do you fire at something when you can't even decide what counts as its heart? And through it all, the people of Earth stood transfixed by the silent ballet unfolding overhead. Some whispered it was the end of days. Others, defiant, swore no invader would ever bend humanity to its will. But most simply watched, too stunned to translate what their eyes were telling them into anything the mind could carry. When the Zalaran ships completed their orbit and slid behind the curve of the planet, night returned in full. For a moment, it almost looked normal again. Quiet darkness, familiar stars, the distant glow of cities, the comfort of the old sky. But the illusion didn't hold, because everyone could feel it now. A pressure behind the ribs, a new weight in the air. Even in that hush, everyone understood the same thing. The world had already changed. The sky itself had declared it. Without ceremony, nothing would ever be the same. And on that rooftop, in Rio, the child, still staring upward, crouched and traced a small shape in the dust beside her bare foot. A cracked circle, a single line, rising through the break. She didn't know why she drew it. She only knew it made her feel just, for a second, less small. Chapter 2. The Ultimatum. The next transmission began before dawn, had fully broken over Europe, as if the Zalarans preferred humanity, tired, bleary-eyed, and off balance. In the first flickering seconds, every screen on Earth displayed the same image, a world map, not the messy political version people fought over. A clean, delicate outline, continents traced in thin blue lines like a diagram in a textbook. Then piece by piece, cities began to glow red, not all at once, not randomly, one by one, as though an invisible hand were selecting them for judgment. Names appeared in a spidery alien script. Translation algorithms stuttered and churned, then coughed up phrases that landed like stones in the stomach. Primary targets, secondary compliance zones, tertiary cleansing contingency. In London, a nurse on a late shift watched her city flare red and felt her knees go soft. In Cairo, a father turned the screen away from his children, then saw the glow reflected in the window anyway. Deep in the Rocky Mountain shelter, Dr. Ileana Ruiz stared at the map and whispered, without meaning to, "They're labeling us like cargo." A shape formed at the center of every feed, a figure tall and draped in segmented armor that shimmered like the carapace of a deep-sea creature. Where a face should have been, there was only a dark void. Not a helmet, a hole. Inside it, faint green eddies spiraled and vanished, like something alive breathing through smoke. When the figure spoke, the voice was curiously smooth, almost gentle, the tone of someone explaining an unavoidable fact to a child who hadn't learned what consequence meant. People of Earth, it began. In English first, then Mandarin, Arabic, Hindi, Russian, and every other tongue. Not translated with warmth, translated with perfect, indifferent accuracy. This is Commander Sarek of the Zalaran Imperial Vanguard. Your planet has been designated a zone of strategic reclamation. You will surrender all control of your infrastructure, natural resources, and governance to the appointed Imperial Regency. You will relinquish all weapons of war, and you will prepare your populations for relocation as determined by our preservation protocols. Preservation, the word hit like a joke with no punchline. Preservation of what? Bodies, labor, a species file in an empire's archive. On cue, the image behind Sarek shifted. A sequence of visions filled the screen. Not fast, not frantic, slow enough to study, slow enough to remember. A great city in flames. Skyscrapers collapsing under falling debris. A coastal port swallowed by a descending craft so immense it dwarfed the mountains behind it. Columns of black smoke rising over avenues choked with abandoned vehicles. The footage never identified where, never confirmed whether these were projections or strikes already underway. The ambiguity was the point, because uncertainty does the enemy's work for you. In war rooms across the world, advisors whispered furiously behind cupped hands. Military chiefs demanded verification of the footage, but nobody could give it. Satellites were still blind. Suborbital drones went dead the moment they crossed into the upper atmosphere. Whatever the Zalarans had done to Earth's communications, it wasn't a disruption anymore. It was ownership. Sarek continued, voice still maddeningly calm. We will not negotiate. You have demonstrated neither the unity nor the restraint to retain stewardship of this world. We will correct this failing. You have 48 of your Earth hours to comply. 48 hours, short enough to trigger panic, long enough to torture. The map stayed on screen. The red cities pulsed faintly, like slow heartbeats, in homes and shelters, in subway stations and office buildings. Families clung to one another. Some wept openly. Some stared as if hypnotized. A hush fell over the cities. No sirens, no shouting, just the ragged breathing of millions trying to decide whether this was the moment history stopped. And for a moment, it almost did. The shock was too complete, the spectacle too final. Generations had grown up believing humans were masters of their destiny, that nothing could challenge the primacy of their species. And now, there it was, undeniable. The universe was wider and more merciless than anyone had dared to imagine. In that awful quiet, capitulation didn't feel like cowardice. It felt like math. Governments issued statements carefully worded to sound brave, while the fear leaked through every syllable. Religious leaders counseled surrender, arguing survival was worth any price. Even hardened skeptics caught themselves wondering whether resistance was just another word for suicide. In a shelter beneath Paris, a woman pressed her forehead to a concrete wall and whispered, "We can't fight this guy." The man beside her didn't answer. He reached into a dying fire, took a piece of charcoal, and drew a small symbol on the wall. A cracked circle, a line rising through the break. The woman stared at it. "Why are you drawing that?" she asked. He shrugged, but his throat worked like he was swallowing something sharp. "Because I don't want my last act on this earth to be kneeling somewhere behind the spreading despair. Something older and more stubborn flickered to life, not courage, Not yet. Courage was too clean a word. This was uglier, more primal, the first reflex of a creature that had always refused to accept limits imposed by nature or by other minds. The 48 hours began to tick down, the ultimatum looping over every screen, and the world hovered on the brink, one step away from bowing its head forever. But under that hovering silence, in the places the Zalarans had already forgotten, basements, tunnels, back rooms, rusted radios, human hands began to move, not in triumph, not even in hope, in refusal. And refusal, once it starts, is hard to extinguish. Chapter 3. The spark of defiance as dawn bled light over battered skylines. The ultimatum kept cycling. Every language, every screen that still functioned. In every city square, Commander Sarek's smooth, hollow voice unspooled cold instructions with the casual finality of a receipt. Surrender your weapons, your governments, your autonomy. Evacuate your homes. Await processing. Between the lines, it was always the same simple demand. Become manageable. The broadcast fed itself on terror images chosen like weapons. Burning cities, descending ships, calculated footage of Zalaran landers opening like iron flowers, spilling out thousands of drone soldiers in perfect rows, each step designed to smother the last ember of hope. Instead, something curious began to stir, almost imperceptible at first. A murmur on a crowded platform, a raised voice in a crisis center, a laugh too sharp, too sudden in a shelter that hadn't laughed in days. It sounded like denial or madness. But as the hours passed, that scattered muttering hardened into something else entirely. Not bravery, not yet. Something older. A refusal that didn't need permission. In a field outside Warsaw, an old woman with white hair walked across churned mud toward the remains of a toppled broadcasting tower. The metal lay twisted like a broken spine. She carried a flag, not a grand banner, just a length of red and white fabric she'd kept folded in a drawer since girlhood, patched and faded, smelling faintly of cedar and time. She didn't speak, didn't look for an audience. She tied it to a bent iron rod jutting from the wreckage. Tight knots, steady hands, then stepped back and watched it catch the thin wind. Passers-by stopped. Some lifted phones, taking pictures they didn't know anyone could still receive. A teenager found a working loudspeaker among the debris, blew dust from the microphone, and began reading an old poem about people who refused to be erased. His voice cracked once. He swallowed it and kept going, because stopping would have meant believing the sky. In New Delhi, a line of municipal buses waited, hastily repurposed into evacuation transports. Government officials stood with clipboards and practiced calm. The doors yawned open, inviting, hungry, but the queue never formed. Families stepped aside, fingers laced tight, refusing to climb aboard. An administrator in a rumpled suit tried pleading with them. Relocation didn't mean surrender, just temporary compliance, just survival. A mother holding a child met his eyes and shook her head, not angry, not dramatic, just final. Behind her, the crowd did the same, one by one, like a wave deciding it would not retreat. And in that moment, the administrator understood something no policy manual had ever prepared him for. No argument, no threat of incineration was going to move a people who had decided they'd rather die standing than live as property. In São Paulo, a firefighter chalked a small symbol on a wall beside a triage station. A cracked circle, a line rising through the break. No one asked what it meant. They simply started drawing it everywhere, not as a flag, as a whisper, a way to say, I'm still here. In the Rocky Mountain shelter, Dr. Ileana Ruiz watched the feeds loop and loop. Map, red cities, drone rows, and in the corner of one shaky camera, shot, barely there, she saw it. Someone had painted the same cracked circle with the rising line on a concrete pillar. Ruiz didn't smile. She felt something tighten in her chest, a dangerous emotion. Hope's rough cousin. In Washington, the president stepped onto the White House lawn to address whatever fragment of the nation could still see or hear. He looked older than he had 2 days ago. Everyone could see it. He stood as if the weight of the sky had been set on his shoulders, and he'd refused to shrug it off. His voice didn't tremble when he spoke. To the people of Earth, he began, and to those who believe they have already conquered us, understand this. You can break our roads. You can blind our satellites. You can burn our cities until the maps don't recognize them. But you do not get to tell a human being what they are allowed to be. The cameras found his hands. They were shaking, not with fear, with anger held in a tight, disciplined fist. We will not surrender, he said. Not our histories, not the right to call ourselves free, not the names of our children, not the last breath in our lungs. He paused, looked up at the sky, not pleading, not praying, just meeting it. And then he said the line that would travel through tunnels and radios and walls like fire. If you want this world, his jaw set, you will have to take it from our hands. For a beat, the planet went still. Then, somewhere far below the orbiting shadows, a single voice in a shelter repeated it, then another, then 100, not as a slogan, as a vow. And in that vow, the first spark caught. Chapter 4. Cities in Ash. The first strike came without fanfare. No countdown, no grand declaration, no warning offered in the name of dignity. One moment, night hung over São Paulo, a quilt of electric light stitched between towers. And the next, the city began to erase. Not explode, not burn. Erase. Concrete and steel dissolved into a fine haze that drifted in the warm air, as if reality itself had been sandblasted. The molecular disintegration weapons worked in absolute silence, each beam slicing clean through whatever it touched, reducing matter to motes smaller than dust. Survivors would later struggle to describe what they'd seen. A city dying without a sound. Buildings didn't collapse in any way humans recognized as collapse. They simply stopped existing. Floors and walls vanished along neat, surgical lines, leaving whole districts looking as if a giant hand had brushed them away. And the people inside vanished with them. No scream, no rubble, only emptiness where life had been. In Paris, the first weapons struck the arrondissement along the Seine. The Eiffel Tower flared with one last halo of floodlights, a final, stubborn insistence on being seen, then folded inward and disappeared so fast onlookers had to blink twice to be sure it had ever stood. Bridges evaporated, vehicles vanished mid-traffic. Where thousands of lives had been moments before, there was only a shimmering absence. Air that looked wrong. Beijing, New York, Lagos, Sydney. No hemisphere was spared. The Zalarans weren't simply destroying. They were editing. With flawless tactical calculus, they cut at infrastructure hubs, communication nexuses, centers of cultural identity. They understood something humans had only ever learned in fragments. To unmake a civilization, you don't start by killing its soldiers. You sever the connections that let it remember. It is one people on Earth. Chaos flowered in every street. Sirens screamed, then died when power grids went dark. Fires erupted from ruptured fuel lines, sweeping across blocks already half obliterated. Roadways jammed so quickly, emergency convoys found themselves trapped among the same people they were trying to save. Satellites blinked offline in growing constellations of failure, each one cutting another thread of humanity's shared awareness. And then, Chicago! A studio light glowed over a desk. A woman sat behind it, composed, professional, refusing to let fear touch her face. Her name was Mara Vance. Millions had heard her voice for years and never pictured the person inside it. Tonight, they would. "We are receiving reports now," Mara said, steady as stone as the broadcast stuttered and recovered. "Multiple cities, multiple strikes. We do not have confirmation on..." A producer off camera lifted a handwritten card into her sightline. "São Paulo Goni." Mara's eyes flicked to it. Just a flicker, just enough for the audience to see the human behind the anchor. She swallowed. Behind her, the skyline through the studio glass still held dark silhouettes against the night. But the sky looked bruised, as if something up there had leaned too close. Mara leaned forward, voice lower. "If you're watching this," she said, "find a place below ground. If you're driving, stop. If you're with someone you love, don't waste time pretending you're fine." Her earpiece crackled. A voice broke through, half garbled. Her producer mouthed two words, urgent and unmistakable. "Get out! Now!" Mara didn't move. "People of Earth," she said instead, because she was a broadcaster, and that meant she still believed words could matter. "They told us 48 hours. They lied. They are striking now." She paused, and for the first time, her voice found an edge. "But listen to me," she said, eyes locked on the lens, like it was a person she could pull back from the ledge. "You are not helpless. You are not alone. If the lights go out," the wall behind her shimmered. "Not from heat, not from fire, from something cleaner, sharper." A thin line of nothingness moved through the studio glass, as if someone had drawn it with a ruler. Mara's producer lunged. Too late, the disintegration beam bisected the set with surgical indifference. No explosion, no collapse. One side of the studio remained perfectly lit, perfectly framed. The other, where Mara had been sitting, became drifting motes in quiet air. Her chair vanished. Her notes vanished. Her voice vanished, mid-syllable, snuffed into a blank signal that snapped across the world. Static, white noise, silence. In a shelter, 2 blocks away, a man holding a radio whispered, "No, no," like the word could stitch the world back together. Beside him, a little girl pressed her palms to her ears and asked, "Did the sky eat her?" Her mother couldn't answer because she had watched it happen on a screen, and something in her broke that had nothing to do with buildings. For a time, it seemed the Zalarans had succeeded. The panic was too complete, the scale too incomprehensible. Civilians poured into streets in a tide of fear, clutching children, pets, photographs, anything that proved they had once lived. But then, in the wreckage of Berlin's Municipal Command Center, a team of engineers crawled through ash and shattered concrete and dug through the remains of servers with bare hands. Not because they believed it would work, because doing nothing would mean accepting the edit. In an underground facility near Denver, analysts who'd spent the first hours watching helplessly finally received partial data streams from drone scouts still aloft. They worked by battery lamps and the flicker of cracked monitors, trading coordinates over analog radios, short, clipped updates, civilian movement, damage estimates, safe corridors. In Tokyo, an old civil defense bunker, decommissioned and forgotten, sputtered back to life as volunteers pried open rusted blast doors and began inventorying supplies. No one told them to do it. They simply arrived, one by one, drawn by an unspoken consensus that if the world was ending, Someone still had to keep count of the living. Through the night, in pockets of basement shelters and hidden command posts, survivors began to piece together the shape of the catastrophe. The Zalorans had committed to total infrastructure denial. The logic was clear. A society without roads, power, or communication could not organize resistance. The calculations were elegant, pitiless, and incomplete because the Zalorans had underestimated something they could never quantify in any simulation. The improvisational ferocity of a species accustomed to clawing its way back from the edge. In the shadows of shattered cities, humans began to adapt. They mapped safe corridors through ruins with paper and pen. They reactivated Cold War-era shortwave networks to pass messages across continents. They rigged generators out of salvaged vehicle batteries to power makeshift hospitals and command centers. And on tunnel walls, in chalk and charcoal and ash, the rising mark began to appear. A cracked circle, a line, rising through the break. No one held a meeting about it. No one issued orders. It spread the way stubbornness spreads, quietly, relentlessly. By dawn, amid drifting particulates of everything that had been lost, the first outlines of a coordinated response were taking shape, not directed by any one government or army, but stitched together from thousands of acts of stubborn, anonymous determination. And as the Zaloran fleet repositioned in orbit, preparing its next calculated blow, there were some among them who began to wonder if they'd mistaken humanity's fragile interconnections for weakness, never understanding that in the absence of order, humans did not simply despair. They reorganized, and they remembered the vow spoken into the sky. If you want this world, you will have to take it from our hands. Now the world was ash, and the hands were closing. Chapter 5. The Underground Awakens. The survivors who staggered through the skeletal remains of their cities learned the new geography fast. Up was death, down was maybe. The safest places were the ones no one remembered. Subway tunnels, maintenance corridors, half-collapsed bunkers built generations ago, abandoned when the world decided it would never need them again. History, it turned out, kept receipts. In London, families flowed into the underground with backpacks and blankets, and children who had stopped asking questions. They stepped over cracked tiles and ancient posters peeling from the walls, advertisements for concerts that had already happened in a world that no longer existed. Old train cars still sat on the tracks, doors ajar like open mouths. Children climbed inside them, turning seats into forts, playing quiet games, because loud felt dangerous now. Their laughter echoed hollow in the darkness, not because it wasn't real, because it sounded like something the world didn't deserve anymore. Volunteers dragged generators scavenged from hospitals down the stairs, metal monsters on makeshift sleds, hands bleeding from rope burns. When the machines finally sputtered to life, the sound rippled through the tunnels like a heartbeat, trying to restart. Flickering lights blinked on, revealing faces caked with ash and fear. A woman used the first minutes of power not to charge a phone, but to boil water. A man taped a hand-lettered sign to a pillar, light rationing, 10 minutes per hour. Under it, someone drew in charcoal, a cracked circle, a line, rising through the break. No speech, no explanation, just the mark, a way to say, "We are not done." Elsewhere, beneath Los Angeles, in abandoned flood-controlled channels that once carried storm water, what remained of the Western Defense Command established a provisional headquarters. Cots lined between graffiti-scarred pillars, maps pinned to concrete. A wall of laptops hummed on scavenged battery packs like insects in a jar. The colonel in charge uniform scorched, sleeves torn, moved among her people with the slow purpose of someone who had already accepted the brutal truth. There would be no reinforcements, no cavalry, no clean rescue, only whoever was still breathing. She knelt beside a young private, shaking so hard his teeth clicked. "Breathe," she told him. He looked up, eyes wide and wet. "Ma'am." "What do we do when they come back?" The colonel didn't lie. "We make them pay for every step," she said, and far above the concrete ceiling, the city creaked like a dying ship. It wasn't only soldiers retreating below. In the sub-basements of data centers in Singapore and Seoul, hackers with nothing left to lose began to gather. They carried portable drives, salvageable hardware, cracked laptops. They argued in whispers and worked with furious, clattering hands. Some were barely old enough to remember a world before the internet. Others were grizzled veterans of decade-old cyber wars. They had never met in person. Now, the threat overhead fused them into a single organism with a single obsession: understand the enemy's systems, break the spell. In the sub-levels of a university in Warsaw, engineers rigged antenna arrays from scavenged metal and stripped wiring. They aimed them at the sky like prayers made of math, reaching for the last surviving satellites. Signals came through warped and distorted, but enough. Enough to glimpse fragments of telemetry, enough to plot orbital paths. They taped butcher paper to the walls and drew crude arcs in marker ink, reducing the Zalaran fleet's motion to lines human hands could hold. A young technician with singed hair and cracked glasses stepped back and stared at their map like it was art. Not because it was accurate, because it was defiance made visible. Then something happened that changed the shape of the war. A Zalaran drone fell to Earth, intact, shot down over the jungles of Colombia by a barrage of improvised missiles that had no business working. It tore through canopy and mud and silence, and by nightfall, it was gone. Not recovered by an army, recovered by a farmer with a truck, a brother with a shotgun, and neighbors who understood opportunity didn't announce itself twice. The drone was hauled under cover of rain to a hidden warehouse beneath Bogota. There, by lantern light, human hands pried at the sleek alloy casing. The interior was a wonder of alien engineering. Glowing circuits with no soldered joints, crystalline processors pulsing in patterns no one could read. No screws, no seams, perfection sealed shut. But humanity had never needed to fully understand something in order to take it apart. They did what humans have always done to gods and machines and empires. They opened it. They learned its shape. They took notes. Within hours, teams in South America were photographing raw schematics and pushing them onto underground servers. Encrypted bursts of stolen data leapt between continents, passed through a dozen relays to avoid detection. In a disused subway platform in New York, an old man, once an amateur radio enthusiast, sat hunched over a battered console, hands trembling, eyes steady. He tapped out coordinates in Morse code to a receiver in Munich. Dot, dot, dash. A language older than satellites, harder to erase. Slowly, impossibly, a picture began to form. The Zalaran control protocols were unlike anything on Earth. Frequencies beyond the known electromagnetic spectrum. Signals riding on quantum fluctuations. A lattice of commands so refined it felt like witchcraft. But even witchcraft has rules. And rules can be studied, cataloged, exploited. Among the guerrilla cells forming in the dark, a consensus began to take shape. If the Zalarans could coordinate attacks this precise, they needed centralized command nodes, somewhere in orbit, somewhere hidden among the stars. To fight back would mean disrupting that unity, fragmenting their perfect machine into isolated parts. In old sewers, fallout shelters, and maintenance subfloors beneath hospitals, survivors began to share what they learned. Small groups merged into larger ones. Resistance plans were scratched into walls with charcoal and chalk. Passwords were whispered to strangers whose names no one bothered to ask. Because names were luxuries now, trust was a tool, and time was blood. And though the world above had been shattered, something new and ferocious was taking shape underground. No one called it hope yet. Hope was too fragile a word. This was sharper, a beginning. As the hours passed, the Zalaran fleet remained unaware that in the darkness beneath Earth's ruined cities, humans were already adapting, already imagining ways to turn the enemy's brilliance against itself. Because if there was one constant in human history, it was this. No matter how complete the conquest, no matter how certain the defeat, someone always survived, someone always learned, and sooner or later, someone always struck back. Chapter 6. The Anatomy of Resistance. Deep beneath what had once been a bustling financial district, a laboratory took shape in the vaults of an old bank. It smelled of scorched metal, machine oil, and human exhaustion. Reinforced safes lined the walls like silent witnesses to a different kind of wealth doors, propped open now to store alien components instead of gold. Pale scientists in scavenged lab coats moved between tables littered with fragments of Zalaran drones. Cables snaked across concrete. Diagnostic equipment hummed and stuttered on dwindling battery reserves. Portable work lamps threw harsh white light over bruised faces and bandaged hands. Every mark proof they'd survived long enough to be useful. They worked because the world above had become an eraser. And down here, learning was the one thing that couldn't be wiped away fast enough. The first days were stunned confusion. Nothing about the technology behaved the way it should. Zalaran devices looked seamless surfaces, unmarred by screws or welds. Edges so perfect they seemed grown. Internal components were built from materials no one could name. Translucent lattices that refracted light into eerie spectrums, as if the machines were made of frozen aurora. It wasn't engineering the way humans understood engineering. It was artistry. Perfection pursued for its own sake. And for a time, perfection felt unbeatable. Then, on the third night, a molecular physicist from Tokyo named Dr. Aiko Tanaka sat hunched over a cracked microscope. She had not slept. She had not eaten. Her hands trembled from caffeine, grief, and the low-grade terror of being alive while so many were not. For 2 days, she'd stared at a single Zalaran circuit array, searching for a seam, a flaw, a human-shaped mistake. There was none. Finally, she shoved back from the table and hit it with her fist. The sound snapped through steel and concrete like a gunshot. "Translator," she rasped, voice shredded. When the others gathered, she spoke too fast at first, words spilling out as if she feared the thought would evaporate if she didn't pin it to the air. Then she forced herself to breathe, and she said something so simple it felt like blasphemy. No matter how advanced they are, they still live inside the same universe we do. She pointed at the alien lattice. "Energy flows through this," she said, "like it flows through anything." Her finger traced the pattern, and flow leaves a trace. Within hours, they rigged an array of spectrum analyzers from salvaged lab gear and shipwrecked communications equipment. They wired coils, improvised shielding, scavenged oscilloscopes out of a university basement. They fed power to the alien fragment like it was a sleeping animal, and watched the monitors. At first, the readings were chaos. Static storms, screaming noise, streams of data that meant nothing. Then Aiko leaned closer, frowned. "Again," she whispered. "They ran the same cycle!" Same pulse, same spike, a little cleaner, a little clearer. Patterns began to surface like bones in sand. Certain frequencies repeated with uncanny regularity. Certain pulses always preceded the activation of a weapon. Certain rhythms always arrived before a transmission, like an inhale before speech. A systems theorist from Mumbai, Priya Deshmukh, covered the walls in printouts. Her hands never stopped trembling, adrenaline and shock still living under her skin. She taped waveforms in rows until the vault looked wallpapered with storm clouds. Over and over, she traced the same shape with a red marker, circling peaks and troughs until her fingertips were stained pink. At 3 in the morning, she stopped, stared at the wall, then laughed, once quiet and broken. Like someone who'd forgotten the mechanics of laughter, she turned slowly to the room. Her voice came out hoarse with disbelief. Their predictable silence. Then someone scoffed, because hope sounded like insanity now. Priya lifted a printout and shook it. "Look," she insisted. "They're not improvising." She jabbed at the repeating waveform. They rely on a finite set of command protocols, a limited language. Her red-stained finger tapped the peaks, broadcast over consistent frequencies. Aiko blinked. The chief physicist stepped closer. Priya spoke faster, eyes bright, almost feverish. They designed everything to function in perfect harmony, every unit tuned to the same rhythm. From a logistical standpoint, it was elegant. From a human standpoint, it was a throat, an artery, something you could grab. Because harmony meant reliance. Reliance meant habit. Habit meant weakness. Someone at the back of the room whispered, barely audible, "So, we can learn their music." Priya nodded once. "And if we can learn it," she said, "we can play it back wrong." They tested the idea with crude equipment. A radio technician scavenged parts and built a transmitter that had no right to work. A hacker wrote a program in a language older than the war. They mimicked a simple pulse, just a fragment, just a syllable. The captured drone fragment twitched, a barely perceptible response, like a dog, turning its head at a familiar whistle. The vault went utterly still. Aiko clapped a hand over her mouth, and in that silence, the rising mark's meaning moved through them without anyone saying it. "We're not done." Word of the discovery traveled like fire through tunnels and bunkers. Hackers compiled crude programs to imitate alien signatures. Radio techs scrounged for anything capable of broadcasting those frequencies. Some devices were cobbled together from old television transmitters and experimental lab oscillators. Others were nothing but coils of wire wrapped around iron cores, powered by hand-cranked generators that left blisters and blood on palms. Plans formed in scribbled notes and whispered debates. If humanity could replicate Zalaran signatures, they could inject false commands into the fleet's communication lattice, disrupt supply drones, scramble targeting algorithms, confuse coordination between ships and ground forces. Even if they couldn't destroy the invaders outright, they could force hesitation, force mistakes, force the gods to blink. And while engineers worked, others documented everything, not for glory, for survival. Video cameras recorded every test, every failure, every small triumph, because no team could trust they would live long enough to finish the work. Redundancy became mercy. Late one night, as the lab's generators sputtered and the lights threatened to die for what might be the last time, the chief physicist stood at the edge of the room with his arms folded over a soot-streaked chest. He watched his people hunched over alien trophies' faces, hollowed by hunger and grief, but lit by a single, unbreakable certainty. They were learning. He allowed himself one moment of grim satisfaction. The Zalarans had arrived convinced brute power and technological superiority would guarantee submission. They had never imagined their beautiful, flawless machines could become humanity's teacher. In that underground vault, among dust and wreckage, the first seeds of a counteroffensive took root. Fragile, untested, no more than an idea, but ideas were how humanity survived the impossible. And this idea, that the conquerors could be deceived by their own predictability was the most dangerous weapon Earth had found, because it meant the invaders were not invincible. They were merely consistent, and consistency is something humans know how to break. Chapter 7. A Swarm of Innovation. In the weeks after the first dissections of Zalaran technology, something remarkable began to unfold across Earth's battered continents. Not a miracle, a reaction. It didn't arrive with one dramatic turning point. There was no single rallying cry, no official declaration, no leader stepping onto a stage to tell the world what came next. Instead, it rose the way fire rises, from 1,000 small sparks finding each other in the dark. Cities that had once been engines of commerce were now husks of shattered glass and twisted steel. But beneath the rubble, voices crackled to life on hidden frequencies. In the shadows of collapsed skyscrapers, humanity began reorganizing into something the invaders hadn't accounted for, a machine that could adapt faster than any empire. It started with the radio operators. In an abandoned television station in Brazil, a retired broadcast engineer named João and his granddaughter Leah dragged a transmitter out of a dust-choked control room. The station's logo still hung crooked above them, a smiling mascot from a world that used to sell commercials. João wiped grime from the dials like he was tending a relic. Leah held a flashlight with shaking hands. "Will it work?" she whispered. João looked at the dead screens, the torn cables, the blackened skyline beyond the broken window. "It doesn't need to work forever," he said. "It just needs to work once." They fed it power from a generator that coughed like an old man. The signal leapt, bouncing from one jury-rigged antenna to the next, skipping through the bones of cities until it reached the remnants of a special forces team in Argentina. From there, messages crossed the Atlantic on repurposed undersea cables, because satellites were a graveyard now. In Africa, ham radio enthusiasts who'd spent years talking to strangers for the sheer joy of it found themselves coordinating supply drops and guerrilla raids. From Mongolia to Morocco, antennas sprouted like weeds on rooftops and in craters, each carrying fragments of intelligence, sightings of Zalaran patrols, updates on hacked command codes, whispered instructions to hold out one more day. Sometimes it wasn't even information. Sometimes it was just a voice saying, "I'm alive," and hearing that, hearing another human being in the dark, was enough to keep hands moving. Teenagers became the linchpins of the new network, unburdened by the fear of doing it wrong. They cannibalized anything with a circuit and a pulse. Laptops dragged out of smoldering offices, drones meant for weekend photography, children's toys with short-range radio chips, now repurposed into crude jammers, beacon nodes, relay bugs. They soldered and reprogrammed and rebuilt, often by candlelight, while the sky rumbled with distant impacts. No one needed to tell them what to do. They saw their families huddled in basements and understood instinctively that survival depended on becoming more unpredictable than the enemy. In what had once been Detroit, factory workers and automotive hobbyists turned a derelict assembly plant into a production line for improvised armored vehicles. The conveyor belts were dead, so they became work tables. They welded steel plates onto delivery trucks, replaced shattered windshields with thick acrylics scavenged from storefronts, mounted scavenged electromagnetic disruptors in cargo bay's devices built from stolen alien fragments and human desperation. The machines looked ridiculous. Frankenstein armor, desperation on wheels, but they proved something more important than aesthetics. Humanity refused to be passive. Each time a convoy rolled out under cover of darkness, entire neighborhoods crawled out of hiding to watch. Not because the trucks were beautiful, because they were moving. Because movement meant the world wasn't finished. Cheers echoed through skeletal streets. Someone painted the rising mark on the lead vehicle in white ash. A cracked circle, a line, rising through the break. The drivers didn't ask permission. They just nodded and kept going. Meanwhile, older generations people who'd spent their lives accumulating skills they never expected to need again became mentors, anchors, living libraries. A retired cryptographer in Warsaw taught teenagers how to scramble transmissions to evade Zalaran interception. In a library basement in Cairo, a grandmother who had once been an electrical engineer ran workshops on building field radios from copper wire and salvaged capacitors. She taught by touch hands guiding hands. Because paper was scarce and batteries were scarcer, the knowledge scattered across millions of ordinary lives was coalescing, recombining, becoming dangerous. The resistance had no single leader, no headquarters, no uniform. It thrived precisely because it was too diffuse to eradicate. Every time a cell was discovered and crushed, 3 more appeared in its place. Even as the Zalarans deployed hunter-killer drones and broadcast propaganda promising surrender would be rewarded, the signals kept moving. Sometimes they were encoded messages buried in the background noise of emergency broadcasts. Other times, they came as songs' old melodies repurposed into code. News bulletins with hidden instructions tucked into cadence and emphasis. In a mountain village in Nepal, a boy barely old enough to shave learned to bounce encrypted messages off the ionosphere with a battered ham radio. Thousands of kilometers away, a woman in her 70s deciphered the transmission with a magnifying glass and a pencil, then routed it to a resistance cell preparing to strike a Zalaran supply depot. No one appointed them. No one gave them permission. But together, they formed a neural network that learned and responded faster than any centralized command. This was the adaptive machine the Zalarans had never anticipated. A civilization that, when cornered, could fracture into countless shards, each capable of thinking, innovating, resisting. Where one person fell, another picked up the signal. Where one plan failed, 5 new ones emerged. And in this quiet, relentless collaboration, humanity rediscovered its most infuriating strength. It did not require order to function. It required only one thing: refusal. And refusal, once shared, becomes a swarm. Chapter 8. The first counterstrike. The first coordinated counterattack unfolded with the kind of quiet precision that would later become legend. Not because it was flawless, because it happened at all. Even as the Zalaran fleet hovered above Earth's wounded cities, confident in orbital supremacy, something was shifting in the shadows below. The disparate whispers carried through hidden radios and hand-delivered notes. The hacked waveforms, the stolen rhythms, began to align, not into an army, into a moment, a singular defiant purpose. To strike back, not as one fist, but as thousands of scattered hands reaching for the same throat. In the pre-dawn darkness over the Atlantic, 3 Zalaran supply ships glided toward dropships waiting along the coast of West Africa. To the untrained eye, they looked invulnerable, colossal, sleek, bristling with weaponry encased in energy shields that shimmered like soap bubbles over a blade. But humans had learned something the Zalarans didn't believe primitives could learn. The ships had habits, rhythms, maintenance windows, brief necessary moments when shielding flickered during power transfers. A half-breath of vulnerability between heartbeats. It was a flaw so small it felt theoretical. It was also a door. Hours earlier, under the cover of night, small teams slipped out of tunnels and shattered buildings to converge on the landing zones. Some were soldiers, trained to move without sound, rifles slung across their backs. Others were engineers in scavenged body armor, hauling backpacks stuffed with devices built from parts never meant to meet. A farmer from Argentina with hands like leather. A teenager from Lagos with burned fingertips and a mind that moved faster than fear. A mechanic from Kiev who could make dead machines talk again. The Zellerans would never know their names. That was the point. They were ghosts in the rubble, moving with a focus no invasion fleet could model, and threaded through all of them, like a pulse through a body, was the new language humanity had stolen from the enemy. The Zelleran rhythm, a beat you could mimic, a beat you could poison. In the final minutes before dawn, the signal came, not a speech, not a rallying cry, a single burst of static threaded with coordinates. 3 quick pulses, a gap, 2 more. The pattern Priya Deshmukh had circled in red until her fingers stained. The same rhythm Dr. Aiko Tanaka had sworn belonged to the universe itself on a cracked handheld screen in a drainage culvert. Plain text blinked to life. Window open. 11 seconds. 11 seconds. That was all. Across the coastline, teams moved as one. Makeshift jammers, buried beneath collapsed overpasses, and inside burnt-out cars, roared to life. Zelleran communications stuttered into gibberish. Automated defensive turrets blinked, searching, then fell silent. Confused by false commands, injected into their perfect lattice, for one brief stretch of time, the gods misheard their own prayers. That was the moment the saboteurs emerged. They moved fast, not heroic, not cinematic, practical, terrified, determined. A teenage girl from Lagos face, streaked with grime-hauled and electromagnetic disruptor, the size of a backpack across broken asphalt. Her name was Amara. She was 17. 2 months ago, she'd been arguing with her mother about school. Now, she was sprinting toward an alien ship because the world didn't care what you were ready for. A soldier beside her, older, limping, reached out. "Leave it," he hissed. "We're late." Amara shook her head without slowing. "If we don't plant it," she panted, breath tearing at her throat. "They don't fall." The soldier glanced up at the shimmering shield, at the faint ripple beginning to build as the transfer cycle approached. He saw it. 11 seconds. He grabbed her elbow and ran with her. Above them, the first supply ship's shields shimmered, soap bubble sheen, unreal and perfect. Then, a slight dimming, a momentary thinning, the kind no Zelleran commander had ever bothered to fear. Amara's hands shook as she slammed the disruptor against a containment access seam. It latched with a hard magnetic clack. She fumbled for the trigger. The soldier covered her hand with his steady, firm "Now," he whispered. And in that whisper was every parent who had ever said, "I'm here." Amara hit the switch. The device whined. The shield flickered. The seam lit. A shaped charge from another team. Argentina detonated at the exact instant the protection faltered. A chorus of impacts rolled up the shoreline like a thunderclap. The first Zelleran supply ship listed violently. An explosion tearing through the containment deck. An iridescent plume vented into the dawn sky alien atmosphere, spilling out like a wound. Fire danced along its hull wrong-colored, shimmering like burning oil on water. The second ship lurched. Its power grid failed in a cascading chain of white-hot sparks that lit the ocean beneath it, like a camera flash that wouldn't stop. The third ship engines, shrieking in protest, tried to claw back into orbit, only to drop toward the sea, listing, aflame, shedding pieces of itself like a wounded animal. For the first time since their arrival, the Zellerans experienced something none of their algorithms had prepared them for. Not anger, not confusion. Fear, because fear wasn't the sound of explosions. Fear was a calculation suddenly missing an answer. On the ground, the teams ran. Some made it, some didn't. Amara sprinted across wet sand as the wounded ship groaned overhead. A shadow sliding across her like judgment. Behind her, The soldier who had steadied her hand stumbled, hit the ground, tried to rise, and didn't. Amara looked back once, just once. She didn't scream his name. She didn't know it. She lifted 2 fingers to her forehead, then to her heart. A gesture she'd seen adults make at funerals. Then she ran harder, because grief was later. Survival was now. When news of the attack crackled through Earth's underground networks, exhilaration tore through the resistance like oxygen hitting flame. In hidden bunkers and shattered libraries, survivors grabbed one another and wept. Not because the war was won, because the spell was broken. Across the globe, radios repeated the same message again and again, as if repetition could make it real. They can bleed. The invincible had been wounded. The myth had cracked. In orbit, Zalaran commanders scrambled to contain the psychological damage. Broadcast drones filled the skies over devastated cities, projecting holograms of human capitulation. Cowering civilians, surrendering leaders, fabricated compliance, a desperate attempt to recapture the narrative. But it was too late. Where their propaganda had once planted dread, it now inspired contempt. Children in refugee tunnels painted the burning ships on concrete walls, tiny hands smearing charcoal and ash into crude shapes of hope. Teenagers hollow-eyed rigged transmitters to rebroadcast sabotage footage across every stolen channel. Because the image mattered. Because seeing it meant believing it. In Paris, an old man who had survived 3 wars before this one climbed what remained of the Eiffel Tower's ruins. Not to claim victory, to declare refusal. He raised a flag, scavenged from a government building, and the fabric snapped in the wind like a living thing. A silent message to the sky, we're still here. And as dawn broke fully over Earth, the Zalarans were forced to face a terrible realization. The species they had dismissed as primitive had not only survived, they had adapted, studied, synced their heartbeat to the enemy's rhythm, then struck on the offbeat. Their losses were undeniable, and their perfect system of psychological domination had failed to account for one simple, infuriating truth. When humans saw an enemy could be hurt, they didn't stop. They learned faster. They risked more. They came back, and they kept coming until the impossible finally ran out of places to hide. Chapter 9. The Empire Undone. From their orbiting command vessels, the Zalaran strategists watched Earth with a simmering sensation they did not yet have a clean word for. Frustration implied inconvenience. This was grit in a perfect mechanism, a fault that should not exist. Their species had met resistance before primitive rebellions, predictable uprisings, patterns that collapsed neatly once the right nodes were crushed. But not this. Not something that adapted so quickly, so ravenously, to every setback. They had believed dismantling human infrastructure would fracture the species' capacity to fight, that the loss of major cities and communication hubs would plunge them into disarray, that without satellites, without power, without command and broadcast, humans would splinter into helpless tribes begging for mercy. Instead, the humans became a swarm, scattershot, unpredictable, impossibly persistent. Not one enemy, 1,000. And the most maddening part, the swarm had no head. At first, the Zalarans tried to impose order the only way they understood. Target command. They bombarded military installations, known government bunkers, data centers, facilities that, by any rational doctrine, should have anchored the human response. Yet with every strike, the humans dissolved and reformed, smaller, quieter, more agile, as if each defeat taught them a better way to resist. Where there had been armies, there were independent cells, now thousands of them, inventing tactics no central authority could have planned. One Zalaran analyst, young by their standards, meticulous. Proud ran the numbers again and again. Predictive models, behavior trees, probability matrices. Each time, the output converged on the same expected conclusion: collapse. Each time, reality refused. On Earth, a farmer in China learned to intercept Zalaran patrol drones, not with advanced equipment, with scavenged receivers and an intuition sharpened by hunger. He fed them fabricated coordinates of phantom resistance camps ghosts on the invaders' holomaps. Entire strike teams diverted to empty valleys. They burned ammunition on shadows. In Brazil, a retired electrician used smuggled alien batteries to power an old broadcast tower, spewing distorted, mocking transmissions that convinced the invaders whole regions were on the brink of uprising. The Zalarans traced the signal, triangulated, deployed hunter-killers, only to find abandoned decoys, dummy transmitters strapped to weather balloons drifting above jungle canopy. By the time the fleet corrected, the real broadcast had already moved. In Warsaw, a teenage girl pieced together a transmitter from scavenged parts. Her broadcast wasn't propaganda, wasn't orders. It was a song, an old folk melody, soft at first, then repeated again, again, again. It spread across hidden frequencies, like ember finding dry grass. To the Zalarans, it was meaningless noise. To humans, it was code, an acknowledgement, a quiet promise that no one was alone. And what the invaders could not quantify, what their simulations could not model, was how powerful not being alone could be. When the Zalarans pivoted to psychological warfare, they expected humans to fracture. They flooded the networks with holograms of human leaders, surrendering. A theater of capitulation, faces pleading for compliance, voices urging relocation. Elegant, efficient, false. Within hours, dozens of real leaders appeared in ragged underground broadcasts, standing in basements and tunnels and half-ruined halls, declaring refusal with cracked voices and dirty hands. The holograms didn't demoralize the humans. They enraged them. Then the Zalarans tried kindness. They beamed footage of alien soldiers distributing food to terrified civilians. A gesture meant to fracture loyalty, to cultivate collaborators. Within hours, resistance operatives had edited the footage, swapped it for scenes of occupation troops torching grain silos. The altered videos moved faster than the originals, carried by encrypted thumb drives and makeshift projectors, because human hands were the internet now. Truth and lie traveled at the speed of breath. Rotating ambush teams became the signature of this new war. When the Zalarans swept a district clean, they returned days later to find it crawling with saboteurs again, as if the ground itself generated opposition. No base stayed static. No tactic lasted longer than it had to. When air patrols tightened, humans went underground. When tunnels were mapped, humans moved beneath forests. When forests were burned, humans emerged in open streets and cut supply lines with homemade charges. Every countermeasure birthed an adaptation. What unsettled the invaders most wasn't only innovation or tenacity, it was creativity. They watched humans turn demolished shopping malls into machine shops, transform cargo containers into barracks, refit children's toys with stolen alien circuits to jam scanners. Nothing was too humble to become a weapon. Every loss became a lesson. And learning was contagious. In quiet moments aboard the flagship, Zalaran commanders conferred in hushed tones. Their reports began to fill with phrases rarely used in their lexicon. Unpredictable patterns, non-standard tactics, psychological resilience. To beings who valued efficiency and order above all, this refusal to be contained, this feral improvisation, felt like an insult to the very idea of conquest. It was as though the entire species of Earth had entered into a silent pact. You will never know what we try next. And so the great fleet glittering hulls, inexhaustible arsenals, found itself locked in a contest it hadn't prepared for. A war not of attrition, but of adaptation. The Zalarans had assumed shattering Earth's cities would shatter humanity's will. Instead, they watched in disbelieving irritation as the swarm rebuilt itself in 10,000 hidden places, growing more inventive, more determined, more certain the only way forward was through. And deep in the flagship's war chamber, a new conversation began, not about conquering Earth, about silencing it, because the Zalarans were finally starting to understand the thing that terrified them most. So long as humans could communicate, even in fragments, the swarm would keep learning. And a learning enemy was an enemy that could someday win. Chapter 10. The Silence Engine. In orbit, high above the battered curve of Earth, the Zalaran Command Council gathered in the cavernous war chamber of their flagship. The chamber wasn't built for comfort. It was built for certainty. A cathedral of conquest-tiered platforms, floating hololiths, cold geometry that made every voice feel small. Their luminous eyes held the calm glow of inevitability, not excitement, not rage. A belief older than argument. Everything breaks. The lesser species below had proven annoyingly inventive, but all cleverness was bounded by physics, by infrastructure, by the fragile chain of electrons that powered every act of defiance. The counselors debated the risk to their deployed forces, weighed the probability of irreparable collateral damage, calculated projected recovery timelines, argued acceptable loss, curves in tones that never rose above, measured, and in the end, they made the decision empires always made. When faced with a problem they could not solve, they chose a weapon that removed the problem's ability to speak. They named it the Silence Engine. The name wasn't poetic to them. It was descriptive. In the annals of Zalaran conquest, no world had endured it and retained the capacity to organize. Its activation wasn't escalation. It was a verdict, a declaration that persuasion had failed. Containment was too slow, and the era of bargaining was over. Finality, rendered as procedure. One counselor older, scarred along the edge of his armor, leaned toward the central hololith. On it, Earth rotated slowly, blue and bruised. "Observe," he said, voice smooth as polished stone. The hololith flared. The planet's remaining transmissions appeared as faint sparks in the darkness. Humanity's last voices, tiny, persistent, infuriating. The counselor's eyes narrowed, almost imperceptibly. "They are learning," he said. It was the closest the Zalarans came to fear. Another counselor replied, clinical, as if reciting a formula. "Then we will remove the medium of learning." A pause. A confirmation token pulsed between them. Consent made official. Somewhere deep in the flagship's body, the Silence Engine woke, not with sound, with alignment. Harmonics locking into place like the teeth of a gear. As dawn crept across the western seaboard of North America, the invaders began transmitting evacuation warnings, ostensibly to spare civilians from harm. In truth, to flaunt the unstoppable nature of the coming blow. The messages repeated in every known language. A monotone recitation of coordinates, countdowns, and a final grim exhortation to comply. In a half-collapsed subway tunnel beneath Los Angeles, a resistance operator listened through a speaker so old it hissed with static. His friend beside him, eyes hollow from sleepless nights, swallowed hard. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. He stared at the countdown like it was a noose. "I don't know," he admitted, voice low. "But it's not normal." Across the continent, in a makeshift hospital on the outskirts of Chicago, a nurse named Maya checked the fuel gauge on a generator that coughed and shuddered like it resented being alive. Children lay on cots in rows, some crying, some too tired to cry. A man with a bandaged head grabbed her sleeve. "Are we leaving?" he demanded. Maya looked up at the ceiling where dust drifted with each distant rumble. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to say anything that sounded like control. Instead, she gave him the only truth she still owned. Stay close. In the Rockies, in a bunker where scientists worked with stolen alien fragments and human stubbornness, Dr. Aiko Tanaka replayed the waveform from the last sabotage. Her hands trembled as she traced the pattern. The broadcast above them was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that preceded a mass grave. "You feel that?" Priya Deshmukh asked from the next bench. Aiko nodded. "It's not a threat," she whispered. "It's procedure." Then, as the appointed hour arrived, the sky brightened in a way that defied description. A cold blue-white aurora rippled from horizon to horizon, not like nature, like code made visible. For a few terrible seconds, it was almost beautiful, an artificial dawn painting bombed out skyscrapers and refugee caravans in shimmering radiance. A child in a basement in São Paulo pressed her face to a cracked window and whispered, "Pretty." Her mother yanked her back so fast she stumbled. No one knew exactly what the silence engine could do, but the shape of it, the confidence of it, chilled even the hardest gorilla's blood. A collective, silent inhalation passed across the continents, as if all humanity braced at once. And then, the world went dark. Not gradually, not dramatically. Instantly, like something reached into the planet and pinched its pulse. Generators failed without a stutter. Radio towers fell mute. Satellites blinked out of service, leaving their orbits as cold, inert husks. Vehicles died, mid-motion armored convoys and lone ambulances alike, rolling to useless stops in rubble-choked streets. In underground bunkers, displays went black. Emergency lights failed. Ventilation slowed to a breathless crawl. In Maya's makeshift hospital, machines keeping people alive went still. The monitors didn't scream. They simply stopped. A long second passed. Then a child began to wail raw and unfiltered, like the first sound ever made. Maya grabbed a flashlight. It didn't turn on. She shook it. Again. Nothing. She forced her voice into something steady. "Candles!" she barked. "Now. Hands, use your hands." In the tunnel beneath Los Angeles, the resistance operator slapped the radio as if anger could jumpstart electricity. No static, no hiss, no life. The silence was so complete, it made his ears ring. In the Rockies, Aiko watched her instruments go dead and felt something inside her chest drop. Not fear of dying. Fear of being alone. A heartbeat later, the great cities fell silent. No sirens, no broadcasts, no beacons. A billion human voices, once connected by invisible webs of electricity, severed into lonely islands of dread. The Zalarans watched it unfold with satisfaction on their tactical hololiths. Every blip representing a human transmission winked out, replaced by the unbroken hush they craved. Analysts declared total success. The silence engine's electromagnetic surge had swept from pole to pole, disrupting every system not shielded by sophisticated isolation measures. Surely the humans' precious networks of resistance, so dependent on communication, so reliant on jury-rigged technology, were now crippled beyond recovery. On Earth, the first hour of blackout brought something perilously close to despair. Entire communities already worn thin by months of siege cowered in darkness, convinced their last defenses were gone. Makeshift hospitals lost power, forcing nurses to work by candlelight hands, slippery with sweat-performing surgery by feel and faith. Families huddled in cellars, whispering that perhaps this time humanity really was defeated. For the first time since the arrival, no songs crackled through hidden frequencies. No coded broadcasts offered reassurance. The sky itself seemed to press down with the weight of absolute finality. In the cold gloom, Zalaran commanders allowed themselves to exhale, confident that this, at last, would end the tiresome struggle. Let the humans cower. Let them remember this day as the moment their defiance was silenced. But as the first day of darkness dragged toward night, they failed to see what always came next. In basements and tunnels and mountain hideouts, humanity did what it had always done. When catastrophe struck, it adapted. Mechanics fumbled through crates of scavenged parts, rekindling old engines that carried no delicate circuits to fry. Couriers on bicycles slipped onto dangerous roads with handwritten messages tucked under jackets. Scouts lit signal fires atop ruined towers, flames licking upward like stubborn prayers. In Maya's hospital, a generator coughed once, then caught. A crude, coughing heartbeat returning to a room that had been holding its breath. The lights didn't come back, but the machines, a few of them, did. Enough. Maya gripped the shoulder of a terrified intern and spoke through clenched teeth. See, we don't need their world to keep ours alive. For now, the silence engine had ended the chatter, and the music, the plans, and the boasts. For a single day, Earth was quiet, but in that hush, something older and more resilient than any frequency was stirring. Because though the Zalarans had extinguished the world's electric heartbeat, they had not yet discovered the truth that would undo them. Silence